History is a fragile thing. What if parts of it have been erased, silenced? What if the chronicles of humankind have a missing chapter, one written in the bones of ancient giants? In our first episode, we peered into the scripture and myth, the Nephilim of Genesis, the Rephaim of Canaan, giants in the earth born of the union of gods and mortals. We remembered Goliath of Gath, said to stand nearly 9 feet tall, and King Og of Bashan, whose iron bed spanned 13 feet. These legends set the stage, but legends are only the beginning. What if history left tangible evidence of these giants? And what if that evidence has been made to vanish? Even a young Abraham Lincoln mused about the extinct giants whose bones fill the mounds of America, imagining that those giants once gazed upon Niagara Falls in ages past. For 2 centuries, whispers and reports have spoken of enormous human skeletons unearthed across the world, discovered, marvelled at, then mysteriously tucked away. In this video, in this second chapter of our journey, we sift through yellowed newspapers, old diaries, and institutional archives for clues. We find tales of giant bones exhumed and exhibited, only to disappear without a trace. We hear allegations of hush-hush museum vaults and silent halls of power guarding forbidden relics. We won't indulge in conspiracies without question, but we will ask the questions. So settle in and dim the lights. This won't be a cheerful story. Our path winds through the shadows of the past, through dusty dig sites at twilight, and museum basements at midnight. What if the bones were real? And if so, why would someone hide them? Ancient Bones and Suppressed Discoveries begins now. Imagine rural America in the late 1800s. Rolling fields, farmers tilling soil once home to ancient peoples. It's in this setting that the first whispered stories of giant bones took root. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers across the United States printed astonishing headlines. Skeletons measuring 8, 10, even 12 feet tall allegedly emerged from the earth. Often these remains came from Native American burial grounds, the sacred earthworks of cultures long past. Small town papers breathlessly described workmen or farmers uncovering colossal human bones in mound tombs or eroded riverbanks. Hundreds of such articles appeared, recounting giant discoveries with lurid detail and little skepticism. Were these simply tall tales and hoaxes? Or did something, or someone, truly gargantuan leave behind its bones? One early account speaks of a discovery in Tennessee, a so-called giant skeleton so massive that enterprising men mounted it upright on a timber frame, standing perhaps 15 to 20 feet tall for public exhibit. Crowds came to gape at this behemoth. Doctors and preachers alike affirmed it was human, speculating it belonged to a lost race of titans. The giant toured around as a curiosity, until a physician named William Carpenter studied the bones and made a sobering revelation. They were not human at all, but the remains of a young mastodon, misidentified as a man. Embarrassed, the exhibitor quietly packed up his giant. There was no fraud intended. Carpenter noted only a widespread desire to believe. The public wanted giants, and so they saw giants, even in the bones of beasts. This cautionary tale set a precedent. For every sensational giant report, skeptics would eventually ask, could it be a mistake? Yet not all reports were so easily dismissed. In many cases, the finds were explicitly human, just beyond normal size. In Ohio 1885, newspapers reported that schoolboys exploring a hillside near the village of Homer stumbled on something extraordinary, huge bones protruding from the dirt. Local adults joined the dig, and by the end, 5 skeletons had been unearthed. According to a New York Times dispatch, 3 of the skeletons measured well over 7 feet, and the largest was just over 8 feet tall. The skulls were so large that an adult man could purportedly slip his head inside one, with room to spare. Villagers collected stone tools, a giant polished pipe, and other artifacts from the grave. The discovery caused a local sensation. Were these the fabled giants of old? The Times piece matter-of-factly described the skeleton's dimensions, treating the find as credible news. And Homer, Ohio wasn't unique. Similar reports popped up around the Midwest and beyond, especially wherever large earth mounds were opened. Consider a 1902 report from Bowling Green, Ohio. A labourer digging in a sandpit uncovered a skeleton of a prehistoric giant. Terrified, he ran to fetch help. A crowd gathered to behold the unearthed bones, which were later laid out in anatomical order at a nearby farmhouse. The assembled skeleton measured nearly 9 feet in length. Even more strikingly, its skull was said to be almost a foot wide and bore 2 distinct rows of teeth in its jaw. Double rows of teeth, an unsettling detail, echoed other reports of giant remains with anomalous dental traits, a feature some linked to the Nephilim of lore. The local story noted the bones were well preserved, save for some decay in the pelvis, and that initial speculation linking them to Native Americans was in doubt, since the skull's shape didn't match known indigenous patterns. Were these bones truly from a lost giant, or just an unusually tall person? We only know the local farmers kept the bones for a time, letting neighbours come and marvel. What became of these bones in the years that followed remains a mystery. The article doesn't tell us. By the turn of the 20th century, such stories had piled up. Ancient giants in the mounds became a staple of frontier legends. Museums and curiosity shops displayed oversized femurs and jawbones, said to be from human giants. Public interest was stoked by these exhibitions and reports, and some people even tried to profit from the phenomenon by creating hoaxes. But many other cases were not blatant hoaxes. They were often sincere, if exaggerated, interpretations of real finds. Researchers later noted that stories frequently ran as straight fact, hoaxes, scams, and misinterpretations of extinct megafauna, all being presented earnestly as giant human remains. In other words, a lot of early giant discoveries likely had more mundane explanations. Large prehistoric animal bones, or normal human skeletons rendered gigantic by jumbled bones and eager imaginations. And indeed a Smithsonian ethnologist, Ales Hrdlička, would later point out that amateurs often mistook big mastodon femurs for human thigh bones. An unfamiliar eye seeing a huge leg bone in the dirt might not realise it came from a mastodon or mammoth, not a man. Hrdlička dryly blamed the will to believe for many giant reports, noting in 1934 that sensational claims of giant skeletons were cropping up 2 or 3 times per month in the news. Even so, the sheer volume of accounts is hard to ignore. Small-town gazettes, major papers like the New York Times, and scientific journals alike carried these reports. Collectively, we have literally over 1,000 such accounts of skeletons 7 feet and taller found in North America over a 200-year span. Not all were mistakes or jokes. Some likely were real burials of extraordinarily tall individuals. After all, gigantism and exceptional height are medical realities. In fact, on the West Coast, remains of indigenous people around 7 feet tall have been documented. Impressive, yet within human variation. These genuine cases lent a kernel of truth that made the wilder stories sound plausible. By the late 19th century, scientists began systematically excavating the mounds. The Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of Ethnology conducted extensive mound explorations in the 1880s under Cyrus Thomas. In 1894, Thomas's team published a massive report concluding that the mounds were built by the ancestors of Native Americans, not by some lost giant race. They did collect thousands of skeletons in the process. None of these official finds, however, were of truly extraordinary size. Once carefully studied, the skeletons fell into normal human ranges. This began to create a schism between scholarly records and the sensational news. Academic experts saw ordinary skeletons of native peoples, while newspapers kept printing tales of giants. When an anthropologist examined one famous claim from 1883, a supposed 9-foot skeleton in Indiana, he found the body was actually only 5 feet 8 inches tall when measured correctly. That case turned out to be, in his words, a giant fraud upon the people. Other cases likely had similar resolutions that simply never made the front page. Skeptics argued that many finds were mismeasured. A skeleton pulled apart and reassembled might seem larger if gaps are mistaken for bone length, for example. One researcher noted that the disarticulated joints in old graves can create the illusion of great height when laypersons try to reassemble the bones. And indeed, this might explain some 8 or 9 foot skeletons reported by enthusiastic townsfolk. Yet tantalizingly, such mundane explanations can't account for everything. Those reports of giant skulls, far larger than normal, stand out. You can mismeasure a skeleton's length, but if a skull is so big it can cover a living man's face, that's not a mistake of assembly. Moreover, if even a few of the hundreds of giant reports were authentic, that means something extraordinary was found and subsequently lost. And here the story takes a darker turn, because as more and more giant bones were allegedly discovered, people began to notice a puzzling pattern. The bones always seemed to disappear. They were sent off to museums or universities for study, and then silence. Artifacts recovered alongside them went missing. Rarely were the oversized skeletons displayed publicly after the initial find. This unsettling trend gave birth to whispers of a cover-up. By the early 20th century, some were already asking, were authorities deliberately hiding evidence of giants? If one name looms largest in this strange saga, it is the Smithsonian Institution. As America's foremost repository of archaeological finds, the Smithsonian received countless artifacts and human remains from across the country, especially during the golden age of mound excavations. It's no surprise then that nearly every tale of giant skeleton ends with "and the bones were shipped to the Smithsonian for further study." Indeed, many newspaper accounts casually mention that some local professor or Smithsonian agent took custody of the oversized relics. For the public, that lent credibility. Surely the prestigious Smithsonian would investigate these anomalies. But as decades passed with no giant skeletons on display, and no formal reports confirming them, suspicions grew. By the mid-20th century, an idea had cemented itself in the realm of fringe history. The Smithsonian was suppressing the truth. This idea burst into mainstream consciousness in sensational fashion in 2014, when a viral article made an extraordinary claim. According to this story, the Smithsonian Institution was taken to court over allegations of a cover-up involving giant bones. The article, which originates from an unreliable source, declared that the Smithsonian admitted to destroying over thousands of giant human skeletons in the early 1900s. It even alleged that a ruling by the US Supreme Court forced the institution to disclose this misdeed. If true, it would validate every suspicion about hidden evidence. However, and this is crucial, no such court case has ever happened. The sensational report turned out to be an internet hoax, traced to a satirical fake news website. Reputable fact-checkers at Reuters and the Associated Press quickly debunked the story, and the Smithsonian spokesperson confirmed it was false. There was no secret lawsuit, no confession of bone destruction. Yet despite the story's falseness, it resonated so deeply because it felt like it could have been true. It was the modern manifestation of a legend that had been building for a century, that Smithsonian scientists deliberately made giant skeletons disappear. Why do people believe this? Perhaps because the historical record shows a pattern of dismissal and silence about the giants. We know, for instance, that the Smithsonian did collect an enormous number of human remains, especially Native American, which were quietly stored away. As recently as 2020, investigations revealed the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History holds over 30,700 human remains in storage, without a full public inventory. That doesn't prove any of these giants, of course, but it does show that an immense amount of human bone material has been locked in cabinets for decades, inaccessible. And within that vast collection, who's to say if a few unusual specimens might exist? The public simply doesn't know, and historically, the Smithsonian wasn't forthcoming about these holdings. Going back to the early 1900s, we find anecdotes fueling the suppression narrative. Some local antiquarians complained that whenever giant skeletons were found, men from the Smithsonian would arrive, pack the bones up, and spirit them away, never to be heard of again. One prominent example in Wisconsin, a 1912 news report described 18 giant skeletons, some over 7 feet, with oddly elongated skulls, unearthed in a mound. The Smithsonian was reportedly involved in that dig. Where did these skeletons go? No records beyond the initial sensational news seems to exist. This gap between publicised discovery and institutional follow-up was fertile ground for conspiracy. We should acknowledge the other side. Mainstream archaeologists consistently rejected the giant craze. Alash Hrdlicka, the Smithsonian's physical anthropology curator, was vocal in debunking giant claims. By 1934, he flatly stated there was no evidence of a race of giants up to 8 feet tall. He chalked all the reports up to errors and the will to believe. In essence, the official stance was that giants never existed, period. If giant bones were reported, they must have been misidentified or fakes. Edlichka even noted with some irritation that these reports cropped up incessantly, several per month in newspapers, and he made it something of a personal mission to expose them. So from the Smithsonian perspective, they weren't hiding evidence, they were denying its validity. They believed there was nothing to hide because all giant bones were either not truly giant or not truly human. But the public imagination is a powerful thing. Fringe researchers and alternative historians began to spin a tale that the Smithsonian was actively covering up any anomalous finds. One off-cited piece of evidence was a 1920s anecdote claiming that a Smithsonian team dumped giant skeletal remains into the ocean to dispose of them, supposedly to keep them out of sight. This story, however, is unverified hearsay. More grounded is the observation that the Smithsonian's own published reports in the late 19th century did occasionally mention skeletons over 7 feet. For example, certain mound excavation bulletins list a skeleton of unusual size, perhaps more than 7 feet, found in a grave. These were noted at the time, but such specimens were later reburied or lost track of, especially as reburial laws required institutions to return Native American remains to tribes. It's entirely possible that some oversized skeletons discovered in the 1800s were simply reburied in the 20th century without fanfare as part of repatriation efforts, hence disappearing from view, not due to nefarious intent. Still, those who suspect suppression ask pointed questions. They cite, for instance, the case of Paxson Hayes in 1950, a hobbyist who claimed blonde giants once lived in America. His ideas were fringe, yet they got repeated in UFO and occult literature of the 1950s. Officialdom ignored Hayes, but the subculture kept his claims alive. By the 1970s and 80s, writers like Eric von Daniken and others in the alternative archaeology scene were tying giant skeletons to everything from Atlantis to space aliens. They alleged that institutions like the Smithsonian had a dogmatic investment in Darwinian evolution and standard history, and anything that threatened that narrative, be it evidence of giants, out-of-place technology, etc., was quietly shelved away. During our research, we find testimonies from modern alternative researchers. For example, a stonemason turned researcher, Jim Vieira, spent years compiling giant reports, and even gave a TED talk about them. He lamented how physical evidence is scant because, as he insinuated, it's been hidden or destroyed over time. Quotes from such figures capture a tone of frustrated determination. Thousands of accounts, yet not a bone on display. It's as if these giants never existed, or as if someone made sure we'd think that. Fringe authors like Richard Dewhurst accused the Smithsonian by name of intentional obfuscation. One fringe outlet even quipped, "The Smithsonian has lots of skeletons in its closet, literal skeletons, 30,000 of them, and who knows how many might be giants." It's important to parse truth from paranoia here. Why would a respected institution hide such discoveries? The Smithsonian itself consistently denies any cover-up, and indeed in 2015, when those fake admission of destroying bone stories circulated, the institution unequivocally refuted them. We also have to note that in the 19th century, archaeology was often tinged with racial assumptions. Many early scholars couldn't believe Native Americans built the mounds, so they loved the ideas of a lost superior race. When Cyrus Thomas proved the mounds were indigenous, it debunked that racist myth, and giant tales tied to it fell out of academic favour. Some theorists today suggest that any actual giant skeletons, if found, challenged the scientific and social narratives of the time, and were therefore suppressed. For instance, alternative historians have argued that evidence of giants would have contradicted the notion of Native Americans as an inferior race. Thus those in power, whether government or academia, chose to ignore or hide the finds. It's a complex claim and speculative, but it highlights the matter isn't only scientific, it's also political. In summary, the Smithsonian Suppression story walks the line between fact and folklore. We know the Smithsonian collected bones. We know giant reports existed. We lack the clear evidence of institutional malfeasance. Yet the perception of a cover-up persists. The absence of giant skeletons in museums today, despite all those historical accounts, is an enigma. Maybe normal processes like decay, reburial, or misidentification explain it. Or maybe, as the theorists contend, the bones are indeed in a crate somewhere in the Smithsonian's basement, deliberately left to gather dust. I cannot claim a definitive answer, but the pattern of vanishing bones is real enough to merit our continued curiosity. And it's not just an American story. Similar tales of giants and their inexplicable disappearance echo around the globe. So let's turn our gaze overseas, and further back in time. Giants are not just an American fascination. Cultures worldwide have legends of colossal people, and intriguingly, there are historical accounts and even alleged discoveries to go with them. Let's journey across continents, piecing together this global puzzle. Keep in mind, as always, we tread the border of myth and reality, where a kernel of truth might hide inside an outlandish claim. Our first stop is Europe, late 19th century. In 1890, French anthropologist Georges Vacher de la Puge discovered enormous bone fragments in a Bronze Age tomb at Castelnau-le-Lez, France. These fossils, a humerus, tibia, and femur piece, were so large that de la Puge estimated their owner would have been 3.5 meters tall, about 11.5 feet. The find, dubbed the Giant of Castelnau, caused a stir. Were these the remains of a real giant? De la Puge published his findings in the journal La Nature in 1890, taking it quite seriously. Other scientists examined the bones. Some thought they looked human, but of unbelievable size. Others suspected they might be abnormal, or even ancient animal bones. To this day, the Castelnau bones remain a bit of a mystery. They are rarely talked about in mainstream circles, but alternative researchers often cite them as evidence that not all giant bones are fakes. There was also the case of Tutankhamun, a supposed 30-foot giant unearthed in France in the 1600s, later exposed as the bones of a large mastodon. Europe, it seems, had its fair share of giant mania too. Even the respected 17th century Jesuit scholar Athanasius Kircher reported on giant skeletons and included fantastical engravings of towering human forms in his books. The line between science and legend was often blurry then. Let's travel next to the Mediterranean, a cradle of ancient civilizations. Here, giant lore runs deep. On the island of Malta, for example, stand megalithic temples so massive that the locals traditionally ascribe them to giants. In fact, one complex is literally named Gantesia, Maltese for place of the giants, because who else could have moved stones weighing 20 tons? While that is legend, there are whispers of physical remains too. Early 20th century excavations in Malta's Hypogeum uncovered skulls that were oddly elongated and large. These Hypogeum skulls sparked rumours that they might belong to an ancient race of oversized humans. They've since been examined and displayed. Most scientists believe the skull's unusual shape is due to cultural practices or natural variation, not literal giants or aliens. Yet the mystique remains. A land of giant-built temples and peculiar skulls fuels imagination. Onto Sardinia, the Italian island rich with Bronze Age sites. Sardinia has what are called tombs of the giants, huge communal graves built with massive stone slabs. Archaeologists say they're giant in size, but were meant for normal people. However, local folklore in Sardinia holds that real giants did exist there. Stories abound of farmers ploughing fields and finding enormous human bones. One Sardinian man, Luigi Muscas, became somewhat famous for claiming he had evidence of giants. He recounted a childhood memory of discovering a skeleton at least 4 meters tall in a cave in the countryside. Muscas said his grandfather already knew about these giants and that many huge tombs were scattered in the area. Moreover, Muscas and other villagers alleged that whenever such bones were found, they ended up in the wrong hands, implying authorities confiscated them. The community even posits a reason. They feel Sardinia's unique neuralgic history has been downplayed, and that acknowledging giants would shine a spotlight on a past the mainstream isn't prepared to handle. It sounds a bit conspiratorial, yet the passion behind it is real. In Sardinia, tales of the Gigantinos, giant beings, are part of the cultural fabric. Indeed, in recent years, Sardinia has drawn attention because of a flurry of photos and videos showing people holding enormous jawbones or teeth allegedly from Sardinian giants. One striking claim was of a giant's tooth, supposedly from Muscas's collection, measuring several inches across, far larger than any human molar should be. A researcher named Paula Harris even shared images of this tooth, stirring debate on fringe channels. While such evidence hasn't been verified by mainstream science, it has fueled the Sardinian giant legends. Locals say that thousands of giant human bones have been found on the island over generations, only to be swiftly taken away by authorities, never to be seen again. It's essentially Sardinia's version of the Smithsonian story: giants found, giants hidden. The regional government and Italian archaeological officials maintain that no anomalous giant skeletons have ever been documented, yet the legends persist. Now hop over to Egypt, land of the pharaohs. Do we find giants there? Ancient Egyptian records don't describe giants explicitly, but Egyptology has its curiosities. One example, in 2017 scientists re-examined skeletal remains believed to be those of Pharaoh Sanacht. He was exceptionally tall for his era, about 6 feet 1 inch, which might not sound giant today, but in 2700 BC, it was extraordinary. A study concluded that Sanacht could be the oldest known case of gigantism in the human record. If true, a pharaoh was literally a giant in the medical sense. However, 6 foot 1 inch is nowhere near the heights in our wild stories. More evocative are the architectural giants of Egypt, the immense sarcophagi in places like the Serapeum of Saqqara. In dark vaults under the desert, archaeologists found over 20 granite coffins, each weighing up to 80 tons, and measuring about 4 meters by 2.3 meters in size. They are so huge one might jest that they were made for giant kings, though in truth these housed sacred bulls. Still, fringe theorists love to point to an odd oversized black granite sarcophagus found in Alexandria in 2018 as the coffin of the giant. When opened, it held normal human remains, but its unusual size raised eyebrows. Egypt does give us one more clue. Text of a much later period, like medieval traveller accounts, occasionally mention seeing giant mummies in Egyptian catacombs. These are likely fables or misidentified animal remains, but they show the allure of giants extending even to the land of pyramids. Crossing the oceans to the Americas, we encounter native traditions and discoveries. In South America, some tribes have legends of gigantic ancestral beings. The Paiute people of Nevada told of the Sitacar, a tribe of red-haired giants. In the early 20th century, guano miners at Lovelock Cave in Nevada uncovered a wealth of artifacts and bones. Among them reportedly were very large skeletons. This find meshed with the Paiute legends, and the story of Lovelock's red-haired cannibal giants took off in popular lore. Scientists later analysed remains from Lovelock Cave and found nothing abnormal. The people were roughly 6 feet tall but not giants. In fact, a study in the 1970s re-evaluating these bones concluded they were of ordinary large individuals, plus some animal bones that caused confusion. It appears that while the Paiute tale is an authentic legend, the giant aspect was exaggerated over time, and the actual remains don't support a race of 10-foot monsters in Nevada. Still, believers counter. Perhaps the truly giant bones were removed long before scientists got to see them. It's a refrain we hear again and again. Farther south in Ecuador, a recent case shows how these stories arise anew. In 2019, an archaeological team uncovered human bones in a village called Hucoy. Rumours soon spread that a giant skeleton had been found. For days the internet buzzed about a lost race of giants in the Ecuadorian jungle. However, a published anthropological study came out, carefully measuring the bones and debunking the hype. The individual, while tall, was within normal human limits, likely just a large human male. No evidence of a giant there. Yet the initial rumour proved how eagerly we leapt to the giant explanation, and how skepticism and careful analysis often arrive later and quieter. From Europe to the Americas, a theme repeats. A discovery is made, word spreads, then it fades away. Each culture's giants might be different. Red-haired cave giants, cyclopean one-eyed giants, gentle temple-building giants. But none of the bones seem to stick around for verification. Does that mean the giants were never there, mere figments of imagination? Or does it suggest a worldwide pattern of inconvenient evidence being quietly removed? By now, we've seen how such claims are often explained away. When enough unrelated cultures separated by oceans share similar giant lore, it's hard not to wonder if there's a connective thread. This brings us to perhaps the most secretive custodian of all when it comes to forbidden history, an institution far older than the Smithsonian, with vaults far deeper. High in the echelons of global power and knowledge sits the Vatican. For centuries, the Vatican and the Catholic Church have sent missionaries and scholars to the ends of the earth. They've collected manuscripts, artifacts, and yes, bones. So it's no surprise that in the realm of giant lore, the Vatican often surfaces as a shadowy player. One line of conjecture revolves around the Vatican's secret archives. This vast repository holds documents and items accumulated over thousands of years, much of it off limits to all but select researchers. The very name Secret Archives invites wild speculation. Among those speculations, that evidence of biblical giants or other antediluvian beings might be stored within. Could it be that early missionaries, say Jesuits in the 16th or 17th century, stumbled upon giant remains in the New World or Asia and shipped them to Rome as curiosities? We have no confirmed record of this, but intriguingly there were reports in the 19th century of giant skeletons found in the catacombs of Rome, purported to be the remains of early Christian martyrs of enormous size. The church never confirmed such things, and they sound more like tall tales. But to those who already suspect a cover-up, the Vatican is an obvious candidate, a guardian of biblical truths, who might hide physical proof of biblical giants, perhaps to avoid causing doctrinal or public uproar. If the bones of Nephilim were found, would these validate Genesis too literally, or challenge church teachings? It's all speculation, but these questions get raised in hushed tones. The mention of Jesuits in remote areas is notable. Jesuit explorers in the 1600s and 1700s were among the first Europeans to penetrate parts of China, India, Africa, and the Americas. They wrote detailed letters home. If any strange finds occurred, they might be in those records. There's one account from a 17th century Jesuit in South America describing encounters with Patagonian giants, drawing on the myth that Magellan and other explorers reported of very tall natives in Patagonia. While those turned out to be tall but not superhuman indigenous people, the Jesuits' willingness to entertain giant stories is interesting. Another Jesuit polymath, Athanasius Kircher, who we mentioned earlier, was fascinated by fossil bones of large animals and thought they were remains of antediluvian giants, as was a common belief back then. In his 1665 work, Mundus Subterraneus, he even includes an engraving of a giant skeleton based on a discovery in Sicily, a find we now recognise as a mastodon skeleton that locals misinterpreted. The Jesuit link in giant lore thus goes back centuries. They weren't suppressing, they were sincerely studying what they thought might be giants. But the conspiratorial angle suggests that as knowledge became more controlled, any giant evidence encountered by Vatican agents was swiftly sequestered. There are whispers, for example, that during missionary efforts in places like Malta or Sardinia, church officials might have taken custody of any oversized bones to remove pagan heresies or avoid stirring superstition. Again, scant proof exists, but local gossip in Sardinia did accuse the church and government of colluding to hide giants. Some point to the fact that the Catholic Church for a long time owned or managed many archaeological sites and museums in Italy, implying they had the means to make inconvenient artifacts disappear. Museums and private collectors beyond the Vatican also figure into these rumours. Did colonial-era archaeologists find giant skeletons in, say, Egypt or Mesopotamia, and then hush it up? There's an oft-cited claim that the mummy of an ancient Egyptian pharaoh over 10 feet tall was once in the Cairo Museum, and then mysteriously vanished from display. However, no documentation of such a mummy exists in legitimate records. In the early 20th century, some spectacular hoaxes ended up in private collections and even sideshows. Those were literally manufactured oddities, not real giants, but they muddy the waters. If someone today says, "I saw a giant skeleton in a private collection," it could be a hoax artifact they saw. And indeed there are still bone rushers, people who scour antique shops or old estates, hoping to find that one giant femur that escaped the Smithsonian net. Let's consider why institutions might stay silent even if they encountered something anomalous. It might not be a grand conspiracy at all, but simply caution. Institutions like the Smithsonian or the Vatican have reputations to uphold. If a discovery is questionable or could cause public frenzy, there might be a decision to quietly shelve it until more is known. For example, if tomorrow the Vatican archaeologists unearthed a skeleton of truly gigantic proportions in an ancient tomb, would they announce it immediately, or would they worry about the media circus the flood of Nephilim proven headlines. Perhaps they would study it quietly for years, or even decide the public isn't ready for whatever implications it might have. This scenario is hypothetical, but it illustrates that institutional silence doesn't always require malicious intent. Sometimes bureaucracy, image concerns, or simple prudence result in secrecy. Nevertheless, conspiracy thinkers often assign a more active role. They'll say the Vatican knows about giants and deliberately hides any evidence to maintain the status quo. Some fringe authors claim that deep in the bowels of the Vatican's archive are not just dusty parchments, but physical remains of biblical giants, brought from the Holy Land or elsewhere. In fact, there is a wild story in circulation about a giant skeleton unearthed in the 1940s in the Middle East that was supposedly sent to the Vatican. This story traces back to a self-published book and is not corroborated, but it feeds into the larger narrative. Powerful institutions as gatekeepers of forbidden knowledge. It's not only the Vatican. Other museums and universities around the world could be implicated. Often it's stated as a rhetorical question. If giant bones were found in China or India, would Western science even hear of it? Or might those relics be quietly studied and hidden by local authorities? One example, in the 1970s, there were claims of huge skeletal remains in China that Chinese authorities allegedly kept secret, perhaps due to not fitting evolutionary narratives, or out of nationalist pride to handle it internally. We have no clear evidence of this either, just hearsay. But it highlights that beyond the Anglosphere, many other places have giant lore, and potential discoveries that are even less documented in English. The truth could be out there, languishing in an obscure museum drawer in Asia, or locked in a cathedral vault in Europe. As we stand back and look at all these institutions, a pattern emerges, not necessarily of a coordinated global cover-up. That would require an unlikely level of collusion, but of a cultural aversion to giants. Giants don't fit neatly in the orthodox timeline of history, or the understood limits of human anthropology. They are outliers, and outliers often get dismissed or ignored in science until there's overwhelming proof. We've seen it with other concepts in history. Certain fossils or artifacts that didn't make sense were shelved for years as unclassifiable. Only later sometimes are they rediscovered and understood. Could giant bones be an example of this? Possibly, though admittedly, we've yet to see a rediscovery of a genuine giant skeleton in modern peer-reviewed literature. In the halls of the Vatican, in the attics of old museums, in the lockers of university archives, could lie a femur too long, a skull too large, and labels that read, "Giant hominid, origin unclear, not for public display." It sounds like the stuff of a Dan Brown thriller, and maybe it is. Or maybe, just maybe, it's real and waiting. These are allegations and whispers, not confirmed facts. We must frame them as such, yet the consistency of these whispers across different countries and decades gives one pause. Are we seeing independent coincidences, or pieces of a grand jigsaw puzzle purposely kept incomplete? To approach an answer, we must examine the possible motives. Why on earth would anyone erase the giants? Let's step back and play devil's advocate, or perhaps angel's advocate given the giant's biblical baggage. Suppose for a moment that giant skeletons did exist and were found. Why would anyone go to lengths to hide or destroy them? What's the threat in a pile of old bones? Exploring this question takes us into the psychology of science, religion, and power. One motive often suggested is religious conflict. If giants were, as the Bible describes, offspring of heavenly beings and human women, or remnants of tribes like the Anakim, whom Israel fought, then physical proof of them would be a huge deal for biblical literalism. It would be one of the few instances where science tangibly corroborates a supernatural Bible event. Angels mating with humans producing giants isn't exactly taught in biology class. For the church historically, certain truths were embraced and others suppressed. The existence of giants touches on potentially heretical territory. Perhaps church authorities in the past feared that confirming those stories would empower occult or pagan worldviews. On the other hand, one could argue the opposite. Proof of giants would support the Bible, so why would the church hide it? Here it might not be the church that has motive, but secular science. That brings us to the Darwinian evolution angle. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, anthropology was establishing that humans evolved from smaller primates and that there were no sudden giant races, just a steady lineage. If a distinct race of giants existed in the recent past, it doesn't fit the evolutionary narrative well. It suggests a branch of humanity or a phenomenon unaccounted for. Some creationists have argued that pre-flood humans, in biblical terms, might have been larger, or that lifespans and sizes have shrunk, ideas mainstream science rejects. If bones surfaced that challenged the current paradigm of human variation, might scientists feel pressure to dismiss them to avoid giving ammunition to creationists or confusion to the public? It's a cynical view, but not implausible. History shows that occasionally out-of-place discoveries were quietly filed away because they didn't make any sense. Could giants be such a case? Another motive, maintaining power over the historical narrative. Information is power. For governments or institutions, being the authority on history means you control the story a civilization tells about itself. Giants aren't part of the official story. If suddenly it turned out that a race of giants coexisted with humans or preceded them, it would rewrite the textbooks and potentially raise uncomfortable questions. Were these giants the basis of all those legends of titans, Jotuns, Rakshasas? Did they build ancient monuments? Why did they disappear? The answers could challenge ethnic histories, religious beliefs, even national origin stories. There might be fear of public panic or fascination that distracts from other matters. Consider the reaction if tomorrow headlines proclaimed 10-foot human skeleton confirmed by scientists. Some would rejoice, but others might feel disturbed or question what else we don't know about our world. In an era where even small scientific revisions can face public resistance, a change that big might be seen as too destabilizing. Perhaps a decision maker would think it better to leave giants in the ground metaphorically. There's also the angle of academic inertia and ego. If you are a prestigious archaeologist who spent a lifetime saying something is impossible, like an advanced lost civilization or a non-human hominid of extreme size, and then evidence emerges that you were wrong, that's a bitter pill. Academia isn't always as open-minded as it idealizes. Peer pressure and consensus can make outliers unwelcome. Anomalous giant bones might be dismissed outright as a matter of principle. They can't be, therefore they aren't. Not so much a malicious erasure, but a refusal to acknowledge, effectively erasing by neglect. Now let's be fair. There are rational reasons to be cautious about giant claims. Most can be explained by known phenomena: misidentified animal bones, human pathology, exaggeration, or folklore being mistaken for fact. The burden of proof for a new species or race of giants is extremely high. No museum today holds a verified 10-foot human skeleton available for study. Given the absence, scientists assume giants never existed, and yet absence of evidence, as the saying goes, is not evidence of absence, especially when evidence might have been actively removed. Some theorists take a more cosmic view. Giants don't fit the tidy story of human origin that either religion or science tells, so they were erased to avoid existential questions. If giants were real, were they human? If they were a hybrid as per biblical law, that would upend how we see ourselves in creation. Even if one isn't religious, the notion of another intelligent hominid race parallel to us in historical times is unsettling. Would it mean we weren't the only humans created or evolved? Would it imply unknown chapters of history where perhaps these giants ruled or influenced normal humans? Those questions are as juicy as they are disruptive. One can imagine a council of scholars deciding humanity isn't ready to rewrite its story with giants in it. Finally, there is the mundane but likely factor: money and credibility. Archaeology and museums rely on funding. If a museum claimed to have a giant skeleton, it might get a burst of public interest, but a flood of scientific skepticism. The risk of being labelled a peddler of myths could threaten funding and credibility. Unless a giant find was absolutely rock solid, an institution might bury it to avoid controversy. Essentially, from a risk management perspective, it's safer to ignore a potential giant than champion it and be wrong. After exploring these motives, one realizes something. Any evidence of giants would sit at a dangerous intersection of science, faith and folklore. In that crossroads, many actors, scientists, clergymen, politicians might have had reasons to steer clear or even actively obscure the truth, if the truth were giants. In a way, giants might be considered forbidden, not because of what they physically are, but because of what they would mean for our understanding of history and humanity's place in the world. Of course, all this is predicated on giants being real in the first place. If they never were, then the only erasure is of errors and fictions, which is just the progress of knowledge. But if even one giant skeleton was real and got hidden, it opens the door to the possibility of more. Could it be a mix? Perhaps many giant tales were false, but a few were true, and those few got suppressed, leaving us with 99 false positives and one true negative that's invisible. It's a haunting thought that the truth could be buried under a mountain of falsehoods, intentionally or unintentionally. Ultimately, whether one leans towards conspiracy or skepticism, asking why erase the giants is a valuable exercise. It forces us to consider how knowledge is handled. It reminds us that history is not just what happened, but what is remembered and what is allowed to be remembered. If giants challenge deeply held paradigms, then the reasons to erase them might be as monumental as the giants themselves. So we circle back to the riddle at hand. If so many people over so many years claimed to see the bones, then where did they all go? The farmers and town doctors of old spoke of giant jawbones and titanic femurs. Newspapers printed their astonishment in black and white. We have those clippings, those echoes of excited voices. And yet when we look for the bones today, we find empty graves and empty answers. Official channels tell us it was all a mix-up, a fantasy. Perhaps it was, but the truth as always feels tantalizingly out of reach, tucked behind a veil of time, and perhaps intention. In the absence of certainty, we are left with tantalizing questions. Are the giants simply sleeping under the hills still, their story untold? Or have their remains been secretly catalogued in some ivory tower, deemed too disruptive for display? The pattern of silence can be as telling as a confession. Silence, after all, is its own message. It whispers, "Move along, nothing to see here." But we heard the old stories. We saw the yellowed headlines. Something was there once. We stand now at the end of the journey, with a chilling realization. Either a lot of well-meaning folks across history were utterly mistaken, or there's been a collective effort to make us forget an entire chapter of our past. In the shadows between science and myth, we've glimpsed shapes, vague giant shapes, that provoke and unsettle. We haven't proven giants existed, but we've surely shown the idea of them has left a giant footprint in our collective psyche. What comes next? We've explored the physical claims. Next, we traversed a realm of story. Our investigation will continue in Chapter 3, Giants Across World Mythology, where we'll delve into the legends themselves and seek common threads that tie these tales to the tantalizing possibility that they were more than mere fiction. Are these myths independent inventions, or fading memories of a real time when giants walked among us? Until then, remember that history has its secrets. Sometimes they're hidden in plain sight, sometimes locked away in vaults. But as long as questions remain, curious souls like you and I will keep digging, literally and metaphorically. The truth may be buried, but curiosity is the shovel. Thank you for joining me in this deep and at times disquieting exploration. If you found this journey thought-provoking, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your thoughts or theories in the comments. Your support helps keep these investigations going. And as always, stay curious and question everything. This is Nex, signing off.